Now it's time to get into what an action potential is a little more detail. I know I mentioned action potentials in the last video and gradient potentials, but there's a bit more to how an action potential is created and what goes into it. So we'll start with the resting state. This is when the membrane is at rest or at negative 70 millivolts, nothing's occurring currently. You'll notice that both the sodium channel and the potassium channel are both closed. Nothing is going through except for a little bit of leakage gating. So leakage gates are always open, a little bit of ion flow, but for the most part, nothing's happening. Everything's closed. The main flow of ions is not occurring. So we'll start then, depolarization. That's the first step. So when you go from rest, the very first thing is to start depolarizing, becoming less negative. To do that, we first need to get a graded potential. Now, it's not usually one graded potential. It could be 2 or 3 or 5 or however many. But the idea is these graded potentials are being received in the dendrites. Now, if enough of those graded potentials can add together or summate and reach threshold, then we're in good shape. But this is the first thing. We have to get the graded potentials. These chemically gated channels open. Ion permeability is changing now, allowing the movement of ions. And those local regions are depolarizing. So if those local regions depolarize enough, so enough of those graded potentials add together and reach threshold, then the critical voltage has been reached. You've reached negative 55 millivolts. So that is your threshold, the negative 55 millivolts. So by reaching negative 55 millivolts, now you simply open up the voltage regulated sodium channels. This becomes self-generating. So once that occurs, once you've hit threshold, the sodium channels open that are voltage regulated, and it becomes self-guiding, self-regulating. It just keeps on going down the neuron, down the muscle for that matter. So this is your depolarization. And once you've opened up these channels, these voltage regulated channels, you'll shoot from negative 55 all the way up to about positive 30 very quickly. So it's a very fast process because of all this sodium ions that come rushing into the cell. This huge influx down the concentration gradients. So what we're looking at here is all this sodium is rushing in. You end up with all these positive ions now inside the cell. The inside of the cell isn't even negative anymore. It's become less negative all the way up to quite often a positive 30 number. But notice, potassium is still closed. So during depolarization, only the voltage regulated sodium channel, or initially the chemically gated channels, opened. But we're looking at really the voltage regulated sodium is what opened. That's what allows us to reach the peak of our action potential here. So sodium diffuses in and depolarizes. That's occurring at that point. But now, all that came in at one point. You had all these positive ions flowing in right here. Well, does positive like to be around positive? No. So this membrane up here is still negative inside. All of these positive ions are going to be attracted to this negative environment. So as the positive ions move down, they're moving down their electrochemical gradient. High concentration moving down to low, and positive moving down to negative. So that's how you're going to stimulate more of these voltage regulated channels open. Because every time you depolarize enough, the channel opens up. More rushes in, and it heads on down the electrochemical gradients. But once that passes by, we need to reset things. That's repolarization. Now notice in repolarization, we've opened the potassium channels, the voltage regulated potassium channels. All that potassium is leaving the cell. The inside is going back to negative. So we're resetting. Sodium is closed down. During repolarization, sodium is not entering the cell anymore. So we're trying to get back to the resting state, back to negative 70 millivolts. So as the sodium stays outside now, it's blocked, potassium is leaving, all this inside is becoming negative again. The outside membrane is becoming positive again because you're losing all these positive potassium ions. So we're resetting the resting membrane potential. The internal negativity is being restored. But sometimes you don't go exactly as planned because you have those potassium channels not closing fast enough. That's hyperpolarization. So the potassium stays open a little longer than it wants to. So you lose a few too many potassium ions. The inside becomes too negative. So instead of resting membrane potential at negative 70 millivolts, now maybe you've gone to negative 73 millivolts or negative 75 millivolts, maybe even negative 80 millivolts. The idea is hyperpolarization went beyond the resting state. Those potassium channels just did open a little bit too long. Now, this will eventually get back to resting. That's where the leakage channels come into play. That's where the sodium-potassium pump comes into play. Once you've gone a little too far, things kind of balance back out a little bit. Now, I'm not saying this could take a long time. We're talking fractions of a second. But it does take a little more time compared to the initial two stages. So that's where we're talking about the sodium-potassium pump. As we mentioned in previous videos, the sodium-potassium pump is an active transport mechanism. Being an active transport mechanism means it needs ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So now that means we'll put energy in, and the sodium-potassium pump is going to push sodium and potassium against their concentration gradients, basically resetting the concentration gradients as if we were at rest. So it's resetting and restoring not just the ionic, but the electrical conductions here. Because think about it, repolarization reset the electrical, but repolarization didn't do the chemical. Sodium-potassium pump is where you need to reset the chemical. So that's why the sodium-potassium pump is necessary. It resets the other half of the equation. So repolarization brought back to resting state. You reset the electrical. Sodium-potassium pump does the rest of resetting the ionic or the chemical state. So just look at this kind of little chart here real quick. At rest, negative 70 millivolts, nothing's happening. That's down here. But then if you notice, you have this initial part, and there's that little blip at negative 55. That's the graded channels all working together to reach threshold. Once you reach threshold right here at negative 55, then this is when the voltage regulated sodium channels open up, a very quick depolarization. Then what happens is you fall back down. This is repolarization. That is going to be the potassium channels, the voltage regulated potassium channels are open. And then hyperpolarization is the bottom here. That's everything just kind of trying to reset. Looking at the leakage channels, looking at the sodium-potassium pump, trying to get all the ions back where they should to return to rest over here. So as you think about it, right here, when we have the graded potentials occurring, those are chemically gated channels. Then when we go through this part, depolarization, that is the voltage regulated sodium channel open, voltage regulated potassium channels are closed. We then try the repolarization, Repolarization has the voltage regulated sodium channels closed and the voltage regulated potassium channels opened. And then at the very bottom, hyperpolarization, that was because those voltage regulated potassium channels stayed open a little bit too long. By the time you get to rest, both sets of voltage regulated sodium and potassium channels are closed. So understanding where the different channels are opening and closing helps understand which ions are moving and which parts of the curve we're in: depolarization, repolarization, hyperpolarization, or at rest. So the action potential, just a few different parts and pieces to kind of put together as far as how it works.